What's up, family? This your girl, Empress Goddess. I hope you're doing well. Yeah, I'm moving a little slow this morning.
Moors of Barbary. He later visited the Cape Verde area where the Zwarte Moren lived. In the Pernambuco area, Staten mentions 30 Moren in Brazilianische Slaven, 30 Moors and Tupi slaves. His translator into Spanish, Edmundo Wernicke, notes that in Alemán Mor indica a la persona de cutis obscura. Los morenos blancos eran los moros, mientras los morenos negros eran los africanos en el lenguaje alemán en el siglo XVII. In other words, Moor indicated a non-white or Moreno person, and it could refer to Moros of North Africa as well as to black Africans with suitable modifiers. The same translator also notes in regards to the reference to Moran and Brazilian slaves that La voz de Moran queda explicado como de africanos por la de esclavos anstaden por la general a la parte castellanos y Schmeidel, usa ese voz también como de indígena. In short, both Staden and Schmeidel utilized the term Morin to refer to natives, as did the Castilians. In his translation of Schmeidel's diary, Wernicke states, Moran alemán indica a todo persona de cutis obscuro. That is, that in German, Moor meant persons of dark skin. Significantly, Staden's diary was published in Dutch, Flemish, at Antwerp in 1558, at Amsterdam in 1563, and 3 German reprints appeared in the same period. Filippo Pigafetti's work on the Congo, published in Dutch in 1596, translated Italian black into zwart and said, Of de kinderen van de Portugezen die in deze gewesten geboren worden van vrouwen van Congo, zwart of it, of Giswat zijn, and diem in Moluccan meant. That is, the mixed blood children of Portuguese men and Congolese women were either black or white or yellow-black, olivestre, pardo, and were called Moluccan, a Dutch equivalent to mulattoes. Although zwart is used in reference to color, the term Morin is used generally for the people from Nubia to Guinea and the Congo. It is also noted that the women and some of the men are not so zwart but are yellowish, hela. The term Morin continued to be used for non-whites. M. Hammersam's diaries, 1639 to 45, published 1663, utilized Morin for both Africans and the Tapuya, the Boyer, of Brazil, who are called Wildenmoren. He also states, Zo zijn de kinder van Kirbeck niet schwarz, wie ihren Eltern, zonder brandlit wie die Brasilianer, die aber van Christen und Moren erzeugt worden, sind gelblich wie Wachs und solche nennen sie Molken. The children of Moren of Guinea were not black at first, but brownish like Brazilians, and those born of Europeans and Africans were yellowish like wax and were called Moluccan. Schoutens, in his Voyage to the East Indies, published 1676, refers repeatedly to the Zwarte Indianen and to an Zwarte Meder, etc. Morin seems to be reserved for Muslims. The Zwarte Borensen are mentioned. Thus, Zwart was used for East Indian Indonesian natives, while Moor was being restricted in meaning, probably due to Portuguese usage. Similarly, the Voyage Journal of A.O. Examelin, originally published 1678, utilizes negers and negros for Africans and blanche or vita for whites. But in a later, modernized edition, Zwartenen is used in such a way to encompass both Americans and Africans, since after describing mixtures of Africans, Americans, and Europeans, the modernizer states, Indien wir an der Slag die dir sein, want den Spanjaarden zijn zeer genagen tot de Zwartenen, meer als door hun eigen vrouwen. That is, the Spaniards were said to be more attracted to Zwartenen, dark or black women, than to their own wives. But the original text states that the Spaniards were more attracted to Negerinnen, black women, or getande Indianasche vrouwen, tanned Indian women, than they were to their own European women. Vendergerst, in his journals, 1688 to 1710, published in 1712, uses Morin in a general sense to refer to Sri Lankans, for example, but also uses Schwarz to describe East Indians. The inhabitants, he states, of Batavia, Java, were Hollander, Morin und Seinsen, Dutch, natives, and Chinese. A lady of Cochin was called a Schwarzenmutter. The Graf's Journal, published 1704, also uses Morin for Indonesians, but he refers to the Morin of Muhammad Tanin, thus making it clear that Morin meant Muslim. In reference to the Javanese and Indonesian wives of Dutchmen, he uses terms such as in zwarte meder. In the latter part of the 17th century, then, the meaning of Moor began to shift from black or non-white to Muslim, including Muslims of the East Indies. Zwart began to be used more generally as a term for non-whites, embracing most of the peoples found from India through Indonesia, as well as Africans and occasionally Americans. Since Moor and Morin had also been used for Americans, Antwerp, 1563, and Brazil, 1550s, 1640s, we can see a pattern where both Moor and Zwart were flexible enough to embrace a broad range of brown to dark brown peoples. It is significant to note that Stodden, 1550s, used the term Moor to refer both to white Morin and to black Morin. As we shall see, this is not reflected in most Dutch dictionaries, but there are exceptions which need to be noted. First, however, I will cite a French dictionary of 1571, which for Moors has Libyans, Barbar, Noir, Firige, Cruel, Vagabond, Negrites, Afrikaans, Numidia. Il y a deux espèces de Moors, à savoir noir and blanc. Thus, there were many negative connotations associated with Moor, such as are also attached to Negro later. But more significantly, the author states that there are both white and black Moors. A Latin-German dictionary of 1573 also refers to de Wiesenmoren, white Moors, although Ethiopia is equated with Morenland. 10 years later, a dictionary states of Ethiopia, quasi nigra vel negredo regio Africa. A 1620 Dutch dictionary defines Moren as Zwarte, Barbarisch, Gegoed, Wild, Wunderlich, Diebsche, Gekrolde, Witte, Gele. Thus, negative connotations continue, but black, white, and yellow are color reference. But what is especially interesting is that from the 1550s until 1620, only white and black are distinguished for Morin, brown, and intermediate colors being ignored until yellow appears. Many dictionaries from the Low Countries continuously equate Moor, Marus, Ethiops, Niger, Mormon with Ethiops, 1588, Moor, Morian with Un Moor o Ethiopian, 1576, Moorman with Ethiops, a Moor horse with Equus Niger, Moor with Marus, Ethiops, Morus, Niger, 1599, and so on. This tendency continues into the 17th century. A 1602 work as well as a 1651 Dutch-French dictionary has Moor, in Moorish. A 1701 Wonderbeck has Moor, Morian, equals un Moor, an Ethiopian. Greater detail appears in Delaporte's 1659 Spanish-Dutch edition, wherein we find Negro equals Zwart, Donker, Bruin. Negro de la Guinea equals Morin of Zwarte van Guinea. Moro in Moor. Moreno equals Donker, Bruin, or Life Color. Moreno, Kosabasa, equals Zwart, Donker. Mesquita, Mosque, equals Kirk, Turkish church. Thus again, as in 1639, Negro can be equated with brown and dark as well as black. Moor is used for a black person as well as Moro, and a mosque is called a Turkish church. In 1691, English-Dutch dictionary has Moor equals Moor. A black Moor equals in Zwarte, Zwarte Morian. A tawny Moor equals in Heila Moor. Thus, English tawny, applied often to Americans, is equated with Dutch heel, yellow. A Dutch Verdenbeck of 1704 preserves earlier usage. Morian Ethiops, dus neemt men alle mensen die zwart zijn. Thus are called all persons who are black. A 1718 Portuguese-Dutch dictionary is revealing in terms of color connotations. Portuguese pardo, applied to Americans, is equated with Dutch donkerverwig and zwartekig. That is, to both darkish and blackish. Negro of Cafri is equivalent to in zwart, Moor, Kaffir. Cafri is in Kaffir, with Moorland. Thus Zwart, Moor, and now Kaffir, Kaffir, are equivalent, and Moorland is still used to refer to the land of blacks. As the 18th century unfolded, Zwart tended to be used in place of Moor in Dutch dictionaries, but a change can be seen in a 1771 dictionary where the author also uses neger. Moor, Moriaan, zodanig neemt men zulke mensen die in zwart hebben, zoals de negers, de Ethiopiërs ens. thus are called such people who have a black skin, such as the Negroes, the Ethiopians, etc. This would seem to apply that niggers, Ethiopians, etc. were only examples of Moor. In 1783, a French-Dutch dictionary states, Moor, habitant de la Mauritanie. Moor, nigger, zwart, Moriaan. Voyez Moor. Moor equals noir, qui est au service de quelque seigneur. Moriaan, Moors ou Moors, habitant de la Mauritanie. Moren, inwoners van Moorland, zwarten, niggers. Noir equals zwart. Noir, sombre, obscur, equals donker, dit, schaduwachtig. Negre, passez-nous en temps à clair noir, que l'on transporte d'Afrique dans la plantation de l'Amérique, equals nigger, zwart. The Dutch-French section has nigger, ZM negre, Moor. Nederland, zie Morenland. Moor, zie Moriaan. Zwart equals Moor or Mar, Homme Noir. Morenland, Negerland, Mauritanie. Thus, this dictionary, prepared by a Dutch author, offers an example of the clear implication of slave status for negre and also for nigger and zwart. We can also see that the transition from Moor to nigger and zwart is being reflected. By 1844 to 5, Dutch dictionaries have shifted the meaning of Moor to a North African. In 1913, it was said of Moor that it was not in common use as compared with nigger and zwart. By the latter year, also it was noted that nigger had replaced negro in the 18th century, and that, by European peoples, the Negroes became especially known as slaves in the colonies. From that, the word Negro also in our language is a very common term. Thus, the close association of nigger with slave is made clear for the Dutch language. Several other Dutch, French, and Dutch English dictionaries also list slave as one of the meanings of negre, negro, more, and zwart. Zwart, meaning black, as can be seen, was not used as a proper racial name in Dutch, and its application was not restricted to Africans. There is, for example, an early reference to de Zwart Indianen, the Black Indians, in Sumatra by a Dutch traveler in addition to the examples cited before. A dictionary of 1728 also translates American Indian from French Indien to Dutch Zwarten. Thus, both Moor and Zwart were applied to East Indian Indonesians and, on occasion, to Americans, as noted. More recently, Asian contract laborers imported into Dutch colonies have on at least one occasion been referred to negercoolies, Negro coolies. It is also significant that the term zwart, black, or zwartje is used by some in the Netherlands today to refer to all non-white or non-European people in much the same way that people in Britain currently use the word black. Usage in English. By the 16th century, the English and Scots were referring to the people of Africa as Moors, and then later as Blackamoors, Ethiopians, and Negroes. In 1591, Richard Percival equated Spanish Mora with a woman black Moor, and Morillo with brown, a little black Moor. Percival was greatly amplified by Minshew in 1599, and we find the following: More, Vido Moro, a black Moor. Mariska, a woman Moor that has become a Christian. Morisco, a black Moor made or become a Christian. Morado color, murrey or iron color, dark color. Morel, brown duskish color. A Moor, the Moro. A black Moor, vid Arab negro. Negrillo, a little black Moor, somewhat black. Negrito, Edom. Negro, black, also a black Moor of Ethiopia. Prieto, or Negro, black, brown. These translations reveal a great deal of flexibility, in that both Moro and Negro are equated with Black Moor, while Black Moor is equated with Arab as well as Morisco and Negro, and Prieto and Negro are equated with brown as well as black. In 1617, Minshew equated Latin Moris with nigger, black, and in another place stated, Moor or nigger equals a Moor, or one of Mauritanie, a black Moor or nigger, vid. A nigger and black Moor and Ethiopian. Negro gradually came to be a common term, especially after extensive contact with the Spanish and the Portuguese. What is not clear is the extent to which the term Negro was consciously translated as black. The automatic association of Negro with black color cannot be assumed for the reasons discussed thus far, and since even many black Africans are actually of medium or dark brown color. In any case, another association gradually arose in North America, and that was between Negro and slave. Early legislation commonly referred to Negro and other slaves, or to Negro, mulatto, and Indian slaves. Over the years, Negro and Black both became synonymous with enslavement. In 1702, an observer wrote that the wealth of Virginia consisted in slaves or Negroes. But 1806 Virginia judges ruled that a person who was of a white appearance was to be presumed free, but in the case of a person visibly appearing to be of the slave race, it is incumbent upon him to make out his freedom. In 1819, South Carolina judges stated flatly, the word Negroes has a fixed meaning, slaves. What the English meant by the term Negro when they first began to use it is not clear. Certainly, it was not then synonymous with slave, as a great many persons so classified were free, both in England and in Virginia. Did it mean an African, a Black person, or any dark-skinned individual? Today, the term is not widely employed in Britain, although the word Black is used to refer to people of various skin colors from all of the South Asia, the Middle East, the West Indies, and Africa. Most unmixed American Indians, if living in Britain today, would be regarded as being Black, especially if their ancestry were not known. Several illustrations can be cited to show that not only Africans, but also Americans and Asians were called Black or Negro in Britain itself in the 17th and 18th century. In 1621, a William Bragg claimed compensation from the Company of East India and Summer Islands for several expenses, including for 13 Negroes or Indian people, 6 women, 7 men, and boys, and so much in the name of God as touching that business, and touching the Negroes or Indians. Bragg hadn't wanted to sell the captives and refused to value them. In 1688, the London Gazette carried an advertisement for a Black boy, an Indian about 13 years old, run away the 8th the same month from Putney, with a collar about his neck with this inscription, "The Lady Bromfield's Black." The 1709 The Tatler carried an advertisement for a Black Indian boy, 12 years of age. Similar usage of language is also found in the play Mangora, written by Thomas More in 1718. In a scene taking place in Paraguay, an American warrior chant to an American woman, "Black beauty, come on, I must love thee or none, you see my face black." A student of the history of Black people in Britain has written that it should be borne in mind that the word Negro in this period, 1600s, could mean an Asian as well as an African, or other person of African descent. Sometimes a performer, in pageants, is identified as one or the other, or the costume provides a clue, though Black performers were often required to personate American Indians. It seems highly likely that the term Negro was used in a very broad manner, especially since it had no more specific color meaning in English than would the words African or Indian. The term Black was also used in a broad manner. In March 1765, English newspapers carried stories about a Native American preacher discovered and helped by the Reverend George Whitefield. This preacher was the famous Sansom Occam, a Mohican from New England. The newspapers referred to him as a Black who could speak English very well and who had preached to crowded audiences. Occam sailed to England that year. An American did not have to go to England to be called Black, however. In Connecticut, in 1711, a family of Indian servants, consisting in one Rachel and her 7 children, were distributed by will and were called Blacks. The British habit of calling yellow, brown, or red people Black is commented upon by Wiley Cypher in his Guinea's Captive Kings. Some examples will now be cited from the Americas to illustrate the use of Negro and Black in English as applied to people of American ancestry. An example from the West Indies is useful. In 1764, William Young was sent to St. Vincent as a part of the British occupation of that island. Living on St. Vincent were about 3,000 Black Caribs, or free Negroes, about 100 Red Caribs, or Indians, and some 4,000 French and their slaves, according to Young. The British found it difficult to control the Caribs, and wars were fought with them in 1771-2, and again during 1795-6. During the latter crisis, Young wrote an extremely anti-Carib tract designed to prove that Caribs, the Garifuna, should be removed from St. Vincent. The latter were eventually defeated, and some 5,000 were shipped to an island near the coast of Honduras. Young was anxious to prove that the so-called Black Caribs were not true Aborigines, but were in fact Negro colonists, free Negroes, or Negro usurpers. This was important to him because he wanted to show that they had no bona fide land rights or aboriginal title. For our purposes, the interesting point admitted by Young is that the so-called blacks or Negroes were occasionally of tawny and mixed complexion because of American ancestry, and that their customs, personal names, and language were those of the native Garifuna. Still further, Young admitted that they had repeatedly intermarried with American women. He consistently refers to them as Negroes nonetheless. Young also relayed a great deal of hearsay information about how the Black Caribs had originated, which is without foundation for analysis here. The important point is this, that a people thoroughly American in identity, culture, and language were called Black and Negro solely because of being mixed with African ancestry. This tendency continues, incidentally, among white scholars who, even today, often refuse to accept the Garifuna's avowed feelings of Indianness and continue to call them Black. In 1619, some 20 Negroes were brought to Virginia. At least 11 have names of Spanish or probable Spanish character. Later, they were joined by Negroes and mulattoes with names such as Antonio, several, and John Pedro. These Spanish-derived servants could well have been of part American ancestry. However, no evidence is available except that they were largely secured from captured Spanish vessels. In 1676, one Gowan, an Indian servant, acquired his freedom in Virginia. 2 decades earlier, Michael Gowan, called a Negro, also acquired his freedom. It would appear that the Negro was probably father to the Indian in this case. In 1670, the population of the Virginia colony was said to be 40,000, including 2,000 black slaves. Evidence indicates that there could not have been that many Africans there, and also that there were a great many American slaves or servants. Thus, the total of blacks must have included a good many Americans. In 1698, 3 fugitive Negroes were reported in North Carolina, of whom one was an American. Similarly, the list of Negroes imported into Virginia, 1710 to 18, by sea includes at least 69 Indians, mostly from the Carolinas. Likewise, lists of Negroes brought into New York from 1715 to 1736 include many slaves of probable or stated American ancestry from Campeche, Jamaica, Honduras, the Carolinas, and Virginia. In the 1715 to 17 period, the Vestry Book of King William Parish, Virginia, records one Robin, Indian, and 2 years later, Robin, Negro. In a similar manner, a 1691 list of Negro slaves in York County, Virginia, includes Kate Indian, while a 1728 list of Negroes at the home house of a Virginia planter includes Indian Robin. Robin, incidentally, is a common name for slaves of American ancestry. In 1748, there was an advertisement in New York for a Negro manservant called Robin, almost of the complexion of an Indian, talks good English, can read and write, and plays on the fiddle. In 1723, Virginia adopted a law depriving free Negroes, mulattoes, and Indians of certain basic civil rights. The act was disallowed by British officials, but in 1735, Lieutenant Governor Gooch defended it by asserting that he wanted to make a perpetual brand upon free Negroes and mulattoes by excluding them from that great privilege of a freeman. He wished to make the free Negroes sensible that a distinction ought to be made between their offspring and the descendants of an Englishman, with whom they never were to be accounted equal. Since the act applied to Native Americans and half Americans, mulattoes, Gooch's language would seem to include them under the general category of free Negroes and mulattoes. A welcome clarification of terminology was provided in 1719 by the government of South Carolina when it decided, and for preventing all doubts and scruples that may arise what ought to be rated, taxed on musties, mulattoes, etc., all such slaves as are not entirely Indian shall be accounted as Negro. The significance of this act is, of course, that all later enumerations of Negro and Indian slaves in South Carolina have to be analyzed with the thought in mind that any Negroes could be one half or other fractions of American ancestry. New Jersey was also an area where Americans and Africans intermixed with considerable frequency. In 1734, an advertisement appeared for the recovery of Juan, W-A-N, Juan, J-U-A-N. He is a half Indian and half Negro. He plays the fiddle and speaks good English and his country Indian. Juan was not specifically called a Negro, but in a 1747 advertisement we read, "Run away on the 20th of September last from Cohansey a very lusty Negro fellow named Samson, aged about 53 years, and had some Indian blood in him." He had with him a boy about 12 or 13 years of age named Sam, was born of an Indian woman and looks like an Indian, only his hair. They both talk Indian very well, and it is likely they have dressed themselves in the Indian dress and gone to Carolina. Similarly, in a 1778 advertisement, we read, was stolen from her mother, a Negro girl, about 9 or 10 years of age, named Diana. Her mother's name is Cash. Was married to an Indian named Lewis Wallace, near 6 feet high, about 35 years of age. They have a male child with them, between 3 and 4 years of age. Any person who takes up the said Negroes and Indian shall have the above reward. From these examples, we can see that people of mixed American African ancestry could be called Negroes in New Jersey. Cyrus Bustle, a Philadelphia baker, black, born in 1732 in Burlington, New Jersey, married a Delaware Indian woman. His son became a Quaker and an anti-slavery leader and was known as a Negro. In Canada, in 1747, 4 Negroes and a Panisse, American slave, escaped from Montreal. A French writer referred to them simply as Negroes. Quite clearly, persons having American ancestry, or the appearance of it, could be called Negroes in Virginia. In 1774, one Robert Chavers, a fiddler, ran away from the South Branch of the Meherrin River in Mecklenburg County. He was called a Negro man, but the Chavers name is common among Lumbee and other Native American groups in nearby North Carolina. In 1773, Tom, a Negro man of a yellowish complexion, much the appearance of an Indian, ran away. His hair is of a different kind from that of a Negro's, rather more of the Indians. In 1777, John Twopence, a Negro man, ran away in Essex County from the Blandfield estate of Robert Beverly. Twopence was of a yellowish complexion. The name Twopence is a common one among Americans in King William County at a later date. In 1759, one Saunders, a runaway slave, was described in South Carolina as a Negro man of the musty breed. Musty meant either European American or American African. In 1775, the authorities in South Carolina were ordered to apprehend John Swan, a reported free Negro or mestizo man. In South Carolina, another runaway slave advertisements showed that the child of a musty woman was called a Negro, 1738, and that a Negro man was said to have had Indian blood, 1748, and that musty men were referred to as Negroes or as one of a group of Negroes, 1756, 1760, twice in 1761. East Indians could also be termed Negro in Virginia. In 1786, an advertisement speaks of an East India Negro man called Jean, a slave-born. He speaks French and English and will call himself free. In the 1780s, certain white Virginians began to agitate for the termination of the Genghis-Khan Indian Reservation in Northampton County. The reserve was described as an asylum for free Negroes, and it was alleged that the Americans have at length become nearly extinct, there being at this time not more than 3 or 4 genuine Indians at most. The place is a harbor and convenient asylum for an idle set of free Negroes. In 1812, it was argued that the place is now inhabited by as many black men as Indians. The Indian women have many of them married black men, and a majority probably of the inhabitants are blacks or have black blood in them. The real Indians are few. The reserve was allotted in 1813, and by 1832, whites had acquired most of it. In 1828, the Genghis-Khan descendants were described as respectable Negro landowners. This episode reminds one of Young's attack upon the Caribs of St. Vincent in 1795, and also of more recent attempts to allot and acquire Indian lands. A similar attack took place upon the Pamunkey Mattaponi in 1843, which failed, and against the Nottoway from 1830 to 1878, which succeeded. By the 1840s, at least 2 Nottaways were registered as free Negroes. The heirs of one family were described in 1878 as all being Negroes and very poor. Aside from Virginia, where persons descended from female Americans imported after a certain date could obtain their freedom, all slaves of American ancestry remained slaves throughout the entire duration of slavery, unless they were emancipated or ran away. At the end of the 18th century, Bob, a carpenter fellow of a yellowish complexion, musty, has bushy hair, ran away. He was said to speak more proper than Negroes in general. Other persons of American ancestry who were free also were called black or Negro. Paul Cuff, the noted half American, half African merchant, was called at various times an Indian, a black man, and this free and enlightened African. He signed petitions with Indian men and all free Negroes and mulattoes. Other examples of a similar nature abound. One author writes that the Sampsons and Galleys, property owners and school teachers, though predominantly of Indian blood, were leaders among the free Negroes of Petersburg, Virginia in 1860. Virginia tax rolls and census records from the 1780s to 1850 have numerous examples of people of Indian tribal identity being classified as free people of color or as mulattoes. In fact, the practice was almost universal. Nonetheless, some were also classified as FN, free Negro, or as B, black, in various records. In certain counties, such as Southampton in 1830, and in parts of Delaware, virtually all free non-whites were categorized as FN, although enumerated under the Free People of Color column. These lists include people of the Nanticoke and other tribal groups. Under certain conditions, persons of African descent could be legally classified as members of an Indian tribe or as Indians. In a treaty with the Creek Nation, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs noted in 1832, "An Indian, whether of full or half-blood, who has a female slave living with him as his wife, is the head of a family and entitled to a reservation of land. Also, free blacks who have been admitted as members of the Creek Nation and are regarded as such by the tribe, if they have families, are entitled to reservations of land." In the 1860s, all persons of African ancestry who had been slaves were granted, by treaty, citizenship in the 5 civilized tribes of Indian Territory. The general trend, however, was to enroll the more visibly part African persons as freedmen citizens and to restrict their tribal status. When lands were allotted in the 1880s to the early 1900s, most such persons were not allowed to assert American ancestry and were, therefore, denied future rights as Indians. During the Seminole Wars, a new term seems to have been coined, that of Indian Negroes. One source, General Wiley Thompson, asserted in 1835 that they are descended from the Seminoles and are connected by consanguinity. Other writers refer to them as the hostile Negroes and mulattoes in the Seminole Nation, or simply Indian Negro. However, in the Yuchi language, mixed people of that type are referred to as Goshbits Chala, or red black people. In North Carolina, many people of Lumbee Indian identity were categorized at times as Negroes. In 1837, Charles Oxendine of Robeson County was punished as a free Negro. In 1842, one of the Brave Boy family was called a Negro, while in 1857, a Chavers was charged as a free person of color with carrying a shotgun. He was not convicted because the act specified free Negroes and he was charged as a free colored. The court stated that free persons of color may be persons colored by Indian blood. The indictment cannot be sustained. In a similar situation, some white men took away guns from the Pamunkey people in Virginia in 1857. The governor had them returned but stated, "If any become 1/4 mixed with the Negro race, they may be treated as free Negroes or mulattoes." Virginia at this time defined a mulatto as 1/4 or more African. In Louisiana in 1856, the Black Code was said to refer to offenses involving slaves, Indians, and free persons of color. Many narratives of ex-slaves recorded in the 1830s reveal Indian ancestry. One such person, called an Indian, was Uncle Mobile Hobson of Virginia. He says, "Had come time to marry, and he married a black woman. That make me black, I suppose." In 1871, a white writer of Maryland observed, "In this Dorchester County at Indian Creek, some of the last Indians of the peninsula struck their wigwams toward the close of the last century, and there are now no full-blooded aborigines on the eastern shore, although many of the freeborn Negroes show Indian traces." Quite commonly, however, some of the freeborn Negroes of the eastern shore continue to identify with and survive as native people. The whites often tried to deny their Indianness, as in 1856, when a marker was erected to commemorate a woman who had testified that the Nanticoke people of Delaware had African ancestry. The Indians were referred to on the marker as arrogant Negroes that assumed to be what they are not. During the 18th century, most persons of mixed race, especially if free, were classified as mulattoes, musties, or persons of color. The term Negro was perhaps less likely to be used for such people, except as noted in the examples before. The usage continued in some states, such as the Carolinas and Virginia, well into the 19th century. For example, the jurists of South Carolina noted in 1852, "It is not according to the use of language in this region to speak of one altogether black as a person of color. The The phrase is almost exclusively applied to one of mixed blood and color. Nonetheless, a change took place in such states as Indiana, 1817, Kentucky, 1852, and elsewhere, 1850s to early 1900s, as the term Negro came to encompass most persons of part African descent. This change may not have affected dark people of solely African and American descent, especially if the African ancestry predominated. Since many, but not all, Native Americans were brown or dark-colored without African ancestry, many of their descendants, when mixed only with African blood, would very likely be seen as Negroes by most Europeans, especially in North America, where special terms for such persons, such as Zambo, Griffo, Lobo, Gafuso, Cabra, and Cobore, never became current, and where musty ceased to be used and mulatto changed its meaning. The United States Census also tended to expand the use of the terms Black and Negro. In 1890, Black was to be used for all persons having 3/4 or more Black blood. In 1910, Black was supposed to be applied only to full-blooded Negroes, while the matter of who was an Indian was left to the enumerator. The term mulatto was to be used for all other persons having some proportion or perceptible trace of Negro blood. It is certain that large numbers of Americans or part Americans were classified as Negro or mulatto under these rules. For example, of the Mattaponi, only one person was counted as Indian by the census out of a reservation population of at least 40 persons. Similarly, the Pusapatak of Long Island had only one person counted as Indian, doubtless because the rest were enumerated as Negroes or mulattoes. The 1910 census counted 2,255 Negroes who were part Indian and were enrolled members of tribes. Another group of 1,793 tribal members were of mixed European, African, and American ancestry. Thus, only slightly more than 3,000 persons who were part African were counted with the Indian population, as compared with the hundreds of thousands who were doubtless counted as Negro or mulatto because of living away from a federally recognized reservation area. In 1930, a person of mixed Indian and Negro blood shall be returned as a Negro unless the Indian blood predominates and the status as an Indian is generally accepted in the community. By 1940, all African American hybrids were to be counted as Negroes unless the Indian ancestry very definitely predominates and he is universally accepted as an Indian. Even pure-blood Indians could be counted as Blacks, as in Nevada in 1880, when the census enumerator categorized 90 members of the Duckwater Shoshone tribe in that manner. In the state of Delaware, more recent decades found that if a person said he was an Indian, he was recorded as either Black or white, depending upon his appearance. The instructions for the 1980 census indicated that any person checking both the Black and Indian boxes was counted solely as Black, although in oral interviews, the race mentioned first for the mother of the respondent would be the one counted. More significantly, a long list of countries was supplied to census takers with the appropriate category to be counted instead of the country name. A large number of countries, including Trinidad and virtually all of the West Indies, were arbitrarily assigned to the Black category. Thus, Americans or part Americans from Aruba, Trinidad, or Dominica would be counted as Blacks. Significantly, not a single country was assigned to the Indian category, including Guatemala, Bolivia, Peru, and Paraguay. Clearly, the census methods in 1980 had the effect of minimizing the count of Indians. In summary, it seems clear that many persons of Native American ancestry, in whole or part, have been at times classified as Negroes or Blacks in the several languages reviewed. This is a matter of considerable significance for the scholars seeking to understand the actual ethnic or racial identity of non-white persons in the slave trade, in the American colonies, and in the United States over the centuries. It would appear that the terms Moor, Negro, Zwart, Black, etc. must be used very carefully in historical, sociological, and anthropological writing. To discover the actual ethnicity of persons so categorized, one must know the specific geographical location from which they were derived. Of course, it is no doubt true that the majority of such persons were usually derived from Africa, but it remains an empirical question as to how many were from India, the East Indies, and the Americas, especially during certain time periods. It is especially important, of course, that census data and other enumerations be utilized very carefully, since it is quite clear that the category of Negro almost always included people who were not of purely African descent. This is especially true in Brazil and the United States area, but also may be applicable to Spanish-speaking regions. Such a conclusion will come as no surprise to many people in the Afro-American community of the United States who have long been aware of extensive Indian ancestry and who have, at least since the Civil War, self-consciously utilized the terms Negro, or Black, and of course colored, to encompass people of mixed Native American and African descent. Individuals such as Ann Plato, Paul Cuff, Crispus Attucks, Hiram Revels, and many others have long been referred to as Negroes, in spite of having perhaps at least as much Native American as African ancestry, and even when living in Indian communities, as was the case with Attucks and Cuff. From a scholarly perspective, the logic of evolving white racism, which has tended to classify people in very arbitrary ways, is neither the logic of genetics nor of bona fide ethnicity. The mixture of African and American does not make a person Black or Negro any more than it makes one automatically Indian. Modern scholars must aver that it is both pernicious and dangerous to read into the evidence and to affirm for earlier times the pronouncements of a dominant social caste. Their myths, their prejudices, and their systems of classification and nomenclature must all be subjected to critical and empirical reevaluation. This necessity for radical reinterpretation will become still clearer as we proceed to discuss terms used for brown-colored persons. 4. Loros, Pardos, and Mestizos, classifying brown peoples. Aspects of color perception, cultural and individual variation. The classification of human beings according to their skin color and other physical characteristics is a very important subject, but one which has yielded a great deal of confusion and controversy. One of the basic problems involved arises from the concept of color itself and, for humans, from the problem of describing intermediate colors, that is, those falling between the extremes of white and black. This difficulty may well arise from the weaknesses of certain languages in terms of their lacking appropriate words, as well as in the complex philosophical and physical issues surrounding the nature of the perception of color. It is to be understood that, even as the Inuit, Eskimo languages have very fine distinctions relating to ice and snow, distinctions totally lacking in many languages, so too we may find languages which fail to make distinctions for a whole range of colors typical of human skin. We may find instead a very unsatisfactory use of a few overworked words, such as yellow, white, and black, which are applied to colors which other cultures might perhaps see as not being at all yellow, white, or black. It may well be that most color terms evolved in connection with such practical tasks as one would find in the tattooing and painting of the body, or later, the painting of cave walls, murals, statues, canvases, dyeing of cloth, and so on. In any case, all of these practices would involve the use of dyes or pigments which, by their very nature, are of a different order from the colors of the human skin. Black and white, when mixed as pigments, may produce gray, but when black and white humans mix, the result is usually some type of brown. In any case, we can argue that most or all color terms developed to describe practical uses, of which the classification of human beings was not one. Moreover, color terms native to a particular language seem to often be relatively few in number and are often used symbolically to stand for a range of shades or objects. For example, the greengrocer sells greens, Grunten, which are often not green at all, but which can be purplish, grayish, reddish, multicolored, and so on. Thus, green has come to symbolize the world of growing vegetable things, as well as many other things, envy, the green light, and so on. It would appear that people living in the Mediterranean zone developed an early awareness of different human skin colors, as witnessed the ancient Kemi, Egyptian mural paintings showing the majority people of Kem, the Black Land, as reddish-brown, and other peoples as darker brown or black, light or reddish-white, and so on. Other groups, such as the Hellenes, Greeks, Canaanites, Phoenicians, Carthaginians, and Romans must also have been aware of intermediate shades between black and white, although perhaps not always being concerned with fine distinctions. The Arabic language, on the other hand, developed a number of terms for human skin color. In circa 1500, for example, we find these correspondence between Castilian and the Arabic of Granada, beginning with darker shades and proceeding towards lighter, the Arabic being written in the then current Castilian orthography. Negro, black, equals asued, quaden, plural. Negra así equals seude, seudin. Negro así equals hakal, kohal. Negro de Guinea equals Asuet men quinagua. Negro asi equals asmar, sumar. Negro de Guinea equals samra, sumar. Negro un poco, a little black, equals camri, camrien. Loro entre blanco y negro, loro between white and black, equals camri, carein. Loro, which leans toward black, borgosi, borgosin. These are not only color terms used for people in Arabic, as, for example, there is an expression, the black and the red, which is said to mean all mankind. Al Ahmar, the red, and Al Aswad, the black. Ahmar means red, red colored, ruddy, rosy, and pink. Another color moving in a darker direction is kamri, translated as loro, and a little black, but rendered elsewhere as golden brown, reddish brown, bronze colored, actually wine colored, from a root meaning to ferment. This term is also said by an Egyptian informant to refer to the common skin color of modern Egyptians, meaning light black and being a favorable skin color. The next term is asmar, meaning less than black, or, in modern times, a polite way, a more favorable way, of referring to very dark persons who might otherwise be called black. There are several words for black, dark, and such terms, but the one often used for black Africans, aside from asmar, is aswad. Modern Arab dictionaries use akmar for the red in Red Indian. In any case, one can see that Arabic has had terms corresponding to Castilian negro and loro, but in addition has had asmar, meaning probably loro, casi negro, and akbar, red for rufo. These are in addition to abiyad for white and relative color terms, dark, and so on. Thus, it would appear that Arabic may be one of the richer of the modern Mediterranean languages in color terminology as applied to human beings. As will be indicated, the Romance-speaking areas by the 1200s to 1400s were using a number of terms to refer to intermediate human colors, such as oliveño, loru, pardo, berretino, rufo, and others. Farther north in the Netherlands and elsewhere, there seems to have been few such terms. An interesting feature of this lack is the failure of bruin, bruni, brown to develop as a common term, resort being had almost always to white or black, or more rarely to some relative concept such as donker, darker. On occasion, yellow was also used to describe brownish persons by the Dutch in the 17th century. Ludwig van Wittgenstein asks, why don't we speak of a pure brown? Is the reason merely the position of brown with respect to the other pure colors, its relationship to them all? Also, brown contains black? How would a person have to behave for us to say of him that he knows a pure primary brown? What does brown contains black mean? There are more and less blackish browns. Is there one which isn't blackish at all? There certainly isn't one that isn't yellowish at all. Dark and blackish are not the same concept. Why is it that a dark yellow doesn't have to be perceived as blackish, even if we call it dark? Darkness is not called a color. In paintings, darkness can also be depicted as black. The perception of color is a complex subject, the complexity stemming from both fundamental physical and perpetual issues and from social, cultural training or conditioning. As Joseph Albers has said, in visual perception, color is almost never seen as it really is, as it physically is. In order to use color effectively, it is necessary to recognize that color deceives continually. It should be learned that one and the same color evokes innumerable readings. If one says red, and there are 50 people listening, it can be expected that there will be 50 reds in their minds, and one can be sure that all these reds will be very different. Everyday language seems to deal with color in a very imprecise and often symbolical manner. White is, of course, a good example since probably few, if any, human beings are white. That is, white is a blank color with, one could say, no color at all. It is significant that in recent centuries, white people have coined the expression colored people to refer to non-whites, thus stating, indirectly at least, that whites are indeed uncolored or blank people. English blank simply meant white. But the fact remains that people called white are perhaps never white. They may be pinkish, light grayish, creamy, very light brown, ruddy reddish, and so on, but not truly white. Thus, white as applied to humans is usually symbolic or nonspecific. Black can also be seen as a symbolic or nonspecific color since few, if any, humans are actually black. The contrast between white and black must have been enhanced by the use of parchment, blank, with ink, black, for writing as well as by other contrasts occurring naturally. But the application of the term white to humans must have arisen from contrasts with people who were of darker color and doubtless arose as a very gross, non-specific differentiation. The use of white as a referent for most Europeans must have arisen from a poverty of more precise off-white color terms or a disinterest in fine distinctions. But the problems of color classification may actually extend to a deeper level of analysis. Ludwig Wittgenstein has commented that, in everyday life, we are virtually surrounded by impure colors, all the more remarkable that we have formed the concept of pure colors. We must always bear in mind the question, how do people learn the meaning of color names? And indeed, the pure colors do not even have special commonly used names. That's how unimportant they are to us. The logic of the concept of color is just much more complicated than it might seem. Not all color concepts are logically of the same kind. The concept of color must be related to problems of perception. The color concepts are to be treated like the concepts of sensations. In my room, I am surrounded by objects of different colors. The place is whitish because the light ball makes the brown table lighter here. At any rate, it is much lighter than the rest of the table, but given a number of color samples, I wouldn't be able to pick out one which had the same coloration as this area of the table. Therefore, from the fact that this table seems brown to everyone, it does not follow that it is brown. But just what does it mean to say, this table isn't really brown after all? So does it then follow from its appearing brown to us that it is brown? There is an indefiniteness about colors. The colors are not things that have definite properties, so that one could straight off look for or imagine colors that we don't yet know, or imagine someone who knows different ones than we do. In fact, it is probably true that the greater number of colors, shades, as seen by the eye, and especially shades of skin, have no names, the meaningless term flesh, meat, colored sometimes being used with obvious inaccuracy. One problem is that colors as pigments, dyes, separately do not at all resemble skin colors and, when mixed, they only serve to approximate to such colors. More importantly, what are the names for the newly created mixed colors? Let us imagine that someone were to paint nature and in its natural colors. Every bit of the surface of such a painting has a definite color. What color? How do I determine its name? Anyone who takes the time to carefully look at another human being or at one's own body will immediately be struck by the fact that there is no single color at all. This is true even in relatively even spread light. But what is also noticeable is that the effect of lighting radically changes the perception of color. In short, most or all human beings are of uneven or mixed color to begin with, and their color changes with changes in light at different times of day, whether inside or outdoors, and in relation to clothing and surroundings. Exposure to the sun also, of course, often results in tanning, that is, darkening. This problem of perception is compounded by the fact that human colors move from the light cream tones of some European to the near black tones of some Africans and others in an unbroken progression providing no clear marking points for guiding us as to when to switch from gross white to gross brown and so on. This unbroken stream of color conforms to no known series of color terms simply because such would require an infinity of terms which remain uninvented. Moreover, the stream actually seems to this writer to possess several currents depending upon whether, for example, a yellow seems to underlay a brown or brown-black, or whether a reddish tone seems to come through the brown or brown-black, or whether it is a gray undertone or overlay, and so on. It is not always possible to compare, for example, the relative lightness or darkness of a particular brown-skinned person because of the indefinably mixed character of the color shades. Imitative pictures may be created, but they also have to be arbitrarily arranged and lack names. Whether, in fact, numerical values on a scale can be accurately assigned to such colors is a subject I won't go into here, except to note that it has no practical relationship to the naming of such shades by humans in any case. How subjective is the perception of color? How culturally determined is the perception of color? Ralph Hattersley describes a phenomenon of sleeping eyes called gray adaptation. Scientists describe it as the habit of seeing a given gray thing as gray, no matter what color the light source used for viewing it. Gray adaptation also refers to the habit of seeing hues, especially gray ones, as more gray or achromatic than they actually are. That is, our brains dechromatize hues, pushing them towards neutral. It would seem that cultural factors might encourage a similar tendency to fail to recognize shades of brown, off-white to brown-black. In short, a process of white adaptation and black adaptation may be characteristic of cultures which were, or are, lazy in distinguishing browns. In this connection, it is worth noting that pardo, used for brownish shades in Portuguese and Spanish, also was used for the gray color of wool. Hattersley notes further that the majority of Western people have eyes that are barely awake to color. A modest number are, however, halfway awake. They see hues even in colors that are assumed to have no hues, that is, in the blacks, grays, and whites. And they readily see that a given dark brown
How about
color may
y'all out there in
actually
them
be a
bushes? How about
low-value yellow,
y'all hit
orange,
that like
red,
button,
or
okay?
magenta. Such
Subscribe or do
variation could
something.
also be cultural, that is, influenced by the perceptual descriptive habits of a particular people. In this connection, also Joseph Albers has shown that even some art students cannot successfully distinguish lighter and darker light intensity without practice. Only a minority can distinguish the lighter from the darker within close intervals when obscured by contrasting
5
hues
people
or by
watching,
different
one
color
like.
intensities.
That don't
Color
make no
is
damn
extremely
sense.
important to us because it gives visual shape and size to all phenomena. Colorless objects are invisible to us, as anyone can confirm who has ever tried to walk through a spotlessly clean, clear glass door. To be colored, to have color, is to be visible. But what indeed is color? Is it a sensation similar to hot and cold, sweet and sour, hard and soft, and so on? Some would say that we do not see colored objects, since we do not look out from our eyes upon objects at a distance. On the contrary, according to one level of analysis, reflected light from the object is presumed to somehow stimulate our eyes and connected nerves to send the brain, or mind, a message about the object, not the object itself. In the mind, in some manner, the message is decoded and transformed into a colored, presumed representation of the object. It is the representation in the mind which is colored, not the object itself. Since we, our minds, have no direct contact with the object, we cannot say that color is a characteristic which is inherent in the object. Instead, it is a characteristic of viewing the object, an act occurring as a part of a physical transaction with the mind. By means of color, we experience visibility, differentiation, spacing, and forming as a mental function. Of course, one problem with this type of analysis is that it fails to deal with the question of what is left of an object after color is removed. Or, to put it differently, this type of dualistic analysis separates, artificially I would think, the mind's seeing from the presumed objective world outside the mind. Such a view cannot be sustained, in all probability, since the various pieces of the transaction between mind and object are all equally perceived in the mind and nowhere else known to us. That is, the eye, the optic nerves, the nervous system, the brain, the light waves, and light itself, including heat, are all perceptions in the mind of a perceiver, no matter what instruments are being utilized to objectively measure or examine the phenomena involved, since these measurements are only known when perceived in the mind or in a computer programmed by a mind, and the instruments are, of course, also perceived in the mind. But however we analyze the perception of color, we find that it is an extremely complex interaction which cannot be separated from habits of the mind, which may be labeled as cultural, social, or individual. Hattersley argues that the grouping or categorization of visual impressions is vital to our survival, and that we tend to frequently lump together things which should be seen as only being loosely related. So the tendency is to form categories, groups, or gestalts, and put things into them that don't really belong. There is a strange psychological law that we follow in this respect. Things that are alike in some ways are actually alike in all ways until it is proved otherwise. The law of similarity is strongest with respect to things we ordinarily pay little attention to. This helps to explain why certain language groups tend to lump all brown, dark brown peoples into a black category. The process of lumping may also be facilitated by a cultural focus upon non-skin color characteristics, such as dark hair or woolly hair, which are used to trigger the use of a skin color category, even when it may not be appropriate. In this situation, indeed, black may not refer to skin color primarily, but to something more complex. In any case, are the colors which we see individual then? Do we all see the same colors? These questions cannot be fully answered, although color blindness indicates that we do not all see the same colors. Probably we learn, within a particular culture or language, to call something black or red. If I call X red and someone else calls Y red, it may not matter if X and Y are functionally related to the same object. In other words, we could not see the same color, but we could communicate because we used the word red in connection with the same object. A problem arises, however, when North American and British whites want to call Native Americans Redskins or Red Indians or Red people, while Latin Americans often see Americans as copper-colored, bronze-colored, or even Indio-colored. Also, Native Americans are perceived as being red, while Mexicans, Chicanos, are not perceived as being red by white North Americans. The latter are more often called brown. These differentiations can have important political and social implications, as also when brown people in the West Indies are called black by outside writers. But my examples may reflect culturally determined subjectivity. I nonetheless use them to illustrate the consequences at the practical level of perceptually determined subjectivity, since it may be that Native Americans look red to some white North Americans while looking brown or copperish to others. It may be that there were people, as from Northern Europe, who did not see some browns but only saw a blackish color. They may actually have been unable to differentiate between shadings of brown. Thus, all darker brown peoples become black to them. Perhaps this is a genetically induced tendency, or perhaps a culturally determined one, or one where the effect is brought about by a combination of defective color discrimination and cultural disuse. In any case, we cannot know what colors are actually perceived by individuals, nor can we say precisely how biology and cultural influence what colors are created in the mind, or which ones that are emphasized at the expense of others. The practical problem is that we cannot know what a Spaniard of 1560 meant by stewed quince color, or what an Italian of 1530 meant by olive-ish color. Nor can we know if there was any agreement among people about such terms, or more importantly, about the colors in the mind conjured up by such terms. This issue of subjectivity is very relevant to modern racial terms used in most Latin American countries and especially Brazil. This will be discussed later. At this point, it is best to focus upon earlier periods. It seems quite likely that most Christian Europeans of the late medieval period paid relatively little attention to human skin color, except as an aid in the identification of a fugitive or as one of several ways to describe an individual. Human beings were still understood to be all descended from Adam and Eve. Thus, all human beings in the biblical tradition were of the same race or stock. Some had become tanned or burned by the sun of the equatorial zone, but the variations were not of fundamental significance. Most slaves and serfs were white and of the same color at birth as were the ruling classes. As we shall see, and has been noted earlier, concern was directed towards developing a very few terms to describe people of intermediate color between black and white. There was apparently no concern or need to identify persons of mixed race, since the concept of race, as we know it, did not exist, and race mixture among humans was not an existent concept. The evolution of hybrid and the concept of racial mixture. The word hybrida is interesting in this connection. The term apparently originated in Roman times to refer to the progeny of a tame sow and a wild boar, also called semifero, half-wild. This meaning persisted for a long time, being used in English texts in 1601 and 1623 for half-wild hogs. Pliny is quoted as referring to mixture with wild in connection with the concept. The term also came to be applied to one born of a Roman father and a foreign mother, or of a freeman and a slave. Antonio de Nebrija, in